Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akeridoluale. The headlines. Mikhailo Podolyak, presidential advisor in Ukraine, says up to 13,000 of his country's troops have been killed since the start of Russia's invasion. Russia and Ukraine exchange 100 prisoners of war. And Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov calls Ukraine comments by Pope Francis unchristian. We begin from Ukraine, where the presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak says up to 13,000 Ukrainian troops have been killed since the start of Russia's invasion. The senior official said between 10 and 13,000 troops had died. It is rare for Ukraine to give figures for casualties, and Mr. Podolyak's comments have not been confirmed by the country's military. In June, he had said between 100 and 200 Ukrainian soldiers were dying daily. Last month, the most senior U.S. general, Mark Milley, said around 100,000 Russian and 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers had been killed or injured since the start of the war. And Russia's defense ministry and the head of Ukraine's presidential administration says the two countries have swapped 50 service personnel in the latest prisoner exchange between both sides. Earlier, the top Russian-installed official in the Donetsk region said Moscow and Kiev would hand over 50 prisoners of war each. Russia said it would fly its released prisoners to Moscow for medical checks and rehabilitation. The Kremlin says that any details of prisoner swap discussions with the United States will not be publicly disclosed, and that Moscow is not planning to engage with the Biden administration before the end of the year. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said the Kremlin considers it unnecessary to publicly disclose the details of prisoner swap negotiations between Russia and the United States. And U.S. President Joe Biden described Russian President Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine as, quote, sick, and said that there's only one rational way to end the war in Ukraine, and that is for Mr. Putin to pull out of the country. Mr. Biden said he has no immediate plans to contact Vladimir Putin, but is prepared to speak with the Russian president if he shows an interest in ending the war in Ukraine, and only in consultation with NATO's allies. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron, who is on a state visit to the United States, said he does not believe allies should push Ukrainians into a compromise with Russia that would not be acceptable for them.
Inflicting incredible carnage on the civilian population of Ukraine, bombing nurseries, hospitals, children's homes. It's sick what he's doing. But the fact of the matter is, I have no immediate plans to contact Mr. Putin. I'm prepared to speak with Mr. Putin if, in fact, there is an interest in him deciding he's looking for a way to end the war. He hasn't done that yet.
And what is at stake in Ukraine is not just very far from here, in a small country somewhere in Europe, but it's about our values, and it's about our principles, and it's about what we agreed together in the UN Charter, protecting sovereignty and territorial integrity.
And U.S. Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland says that Russian President Vladimir Putin had, quote, failed demonstrably to break the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, just as he, quote, failed to break Ukraine with his vicious invasion. Poland did not grant a Russian delegation visas to attend the OSCE meeting in the Polish city of Lodz, and said Moscow would be represented by its permanent representative to the OSCE instead.
Just as Putin has failed to break Ukraine with his vicious invasion, with his war crimes and human rights abuses, and now his cruel attack on the most vulnerable, young people, the elderly, plunging millions into cold and darkness, so too Putin and Russia have failed demonstrably to break the OSCE. On the contrary, this organization, like the UN, has said no to Moscow's efforts to divide it, to paralyze it, to destroy it. It said no to Moscow's attempt to abuse our aspirations for consensus to make a choke collar or a deadly poison on this institution. And if Moscow wants to deal itself out of that, if it wants to set the global example of what abuse of the UN Charter looks like, whether it's at home or in its neighbor or abroad, it can do that while the rest of us work to defend our citizens, defend the values, defend everything that we have built over the last almost 50 years.
Meanwhile, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says that big problems had accumulated in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, accusing the West of spurning the chance to make it a real bridge with Russia after the Cold War. Mr. Lavrov made the comments at the start of a news conference during which he gave a long recital of Russian historical grievances against the West, saying the reckless enlargement of NATO had devalued the basic principles of the OSCE.
The basic instinct, which has never gone away for the Americans and other NATO nations, explains the cause of NATO's reckless enlargement, which devalues the main meaning of the OSCE as a collective instrument to deliver equal and indivisible security, and devalues all these beautiful documents which were accepted in the OSCE since the 1990s. They want to keep Russia out of Europe. The Americans want and have enslaved the whole of Europe. They have taken not only the Germans under their control, but the entire European Union. So after the end of the Cold War, the philosophy of domination and one-sided advantages has never gone away.
And the International Monetary Fund Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, says the chance of global growth falling below 2% next year was increasing due to continued effects of the war in Ukraine and the simultaneous slowdowns in Europe, China, and the United States. Speaking at the Reuters Next conference, Ms. Georgieva says she was particularly concerned about the slowdown in China because the world's second largest economy has been a strong engine of global growth. She also said she will travel to Beijing next week with heads of other international institutions to discuss China's economic outlook and COVID-19 policies with the country's leadership.
We have seen the war in Ukraine, Russia's senseless invasion, holding back Europe most significantly, but also having a widespread impact far from the origins of the war, affecting through food prices and through energy prices, inflation globally, and leading to tightening of financial conditions that throws cold water on the recovery, throws cold water on growth. And two, we are concerned that there is a simultaneous slowdown in the US, in Europe, and in China. And in China in particular, the slowdown is very, very significant. So when we look at the picture in 2023, we are going to come up with an update of our growth projections in January. It has darkened recently on the basis of what we see in consumer sentiment and investor sentiment.
All right, let's talk to Dr. Boniface Chizia, Economic and Business Development Consultant, Chief Executive Officer of the BIC Consultancy. He joins us virtually from the nation's commercial capital. Good morning to you, Dr. Chizia. Thank you for your time.
Ladi, thank you very much for having me. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you, and trust that you're well as well.
Well, we bless God today, yeah.
Are you surprised by the managing director of the IMF's comments about the slowdown in the US and in Europe and China, and why they are now having, she and the other heads of other multilateral institutions are starting by going to China to discuss some of these issues with the country's leadership. Is it that bad in your view?
Well, I think it's they have the data, So some of us can guess. We look at it, we speak as we feel, but they have the data. They do the analysis, they have the expertise, and so if they say so, we better be believing them. I think that they said, I'm particularly surprised that they say that China is most hit. I thought that to some extent China was insulated. So if China is feeling the heat, then that's terrible. Of course, China is an ally of Russia, since they're supporting Russia, China and India. So they are most hit. So that means that they're also feeling the brunt of the war. But, my take is that everything must be done, to bring this war to an end. I think that we need to reclaim our lives, just as we did with COVID. We need to reclaim our lives from this Russian-Ukraine senseless war.
Some of the countries you've mentioned, of course, China, India, the United States, and Europe, generally speaking, these are the key drivers of the world's economy, and they're struggling. They're battling with inflation, but at the same time, they don't want to throttle economic growth. And then, of course, you have countries on other continents, like Africa in particular, which are dependent on these supply chains for their own goods and services and all of that. So do you fear that with what is going on there will be a contagion, a very, very, very big contagion at this end, and we have no safety nets, we have no savings, we have nothing with which we can cushion anything?
Well, the contagion is here with us. It's a global village. That's the word, a global village. So what hits Europe, hits America, and hits Britain, and hits everywhere affects us, because we are all interlinked. And so you find that energy prices are affected, and so to some extent, we're so dependent on the energy and for our survival. So we're also being affected. So I think that it's here, and that's why I say, we need to get back growth. You have the misery index is widely spread across the globe, and that's not good for any economy. It's not good for Nigeria. I think in Nigeria here we are really feeling the heat. So we have a number of issues here. 133 million people in poverty, and that's a massive number. And, when these things happen, we don't seem to empathize. And I feel, have some compassion. It's what will happen is that you might think that you are ensconced in your corner. Right? So you're not going to be affected, but that's a lie. We had an experience, during the COVID. When the crowd started going from estate to estate and saying we're hungry, so I think to get to that, you are sitting in your car, you are driving, and then somebody pushes you out and say, look, I better enter this car. We have to go together. So I think that it's a collective. We have insurable reasons, for us to make sure that the world economy, that we get it right.
The last time I spoke with you, you talked about a symmetry between fiscal and monetary policy. Now, even the most developed world countries, like some of the ones we've mentioned already, are battling with this. They have somewhat contradictory objectives in terms of trying to tame inflation, but at the same time not wanting to scuttle economic growth. And you have just finished saying that we need the growth because that is the only way jobs can be provided, there can be greater money supply in the economies, and goods and services can resume their movement. But are we having some difficulty with that symmetry still globally? I mean, we are at the margins. I mean, let's be honest. We are at the margins here. But in terms of the global economy, that continuous battle between fiscal and monetary policy alignments seems not to be completely good. Everybody is struggling, and I think it's a trial by error that seems to be what is going on. Am I right?
Yes, you're correct. Ladi does a very popular saying that it says the politician is concerned about the next election. And so it's going to be worried about the figures and so on, unemployment, right. And so we're going to election 2023. But here it doesn't seem to count that much because if you take what we have today on ground, the results should be clear. But sometimes, we don't know. So the results come out and then you're surprised. But what you have to say is that sometimes you have to prioritize growth. And so you allow, you permit some aspect of inflation because you want to support growth, you want to get the economy kicking again, and you want to do supply side economics. So to get production going and so on and so forth, you might permit some little inflation to stimulate growth. But obviously the battle between monetary policy and fiscal policy has always been there. In our environment, it's a tough one because the government themselves is beholding the fiscal authorities. But in some climes, it's not so. So you have the head of the Fed in America and so on, to some extent, being more independent than, say, our governor of central bank would be. And so could take a stand as opposed to, what fiscal authorities are trying to, to take. And so that's a challenge. So we have that challenge here. It's been there. The fight has been on, but then I think that central bank, to some extent, is a bit hamstrung. So you find that budget deficit it's going overboard, and then they're pumping in so much liquidity into the system, and which of course is obviously inflationary. And then the central bank is allowed to hold the can and try to fight the mess which fiscal authorities have created. So it's a losing fight up front. And so you create the mess, and then you are trying to fight it. So what then do you do? So I think that's the challenge. And when you don't look at even the instrument which central bank has, to a large extent, which is also play with the base rates. So if you take the base rates, again, sometimes I come to fight this wisdom that the base rate must be used to fight inflation. But also the interest rate is a factor cost, and so also it adds to inflation. And by now you use it because the same wisdom is that interest rate will rise, and it will encourage those who are at the margin, to save, to embrace savings. And so it's a big challenge, and I think that that challenge will be there going forward. But I think that those in the more developed economy are in a better position, to fight it. We have challenges here, we have some issues here.
Now,
but I think that also that. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm happy you mentioned that, but I also wanted to. In the developed economies, everybody was hit by the double whammy. First, the COVID-19, which you referenced, and then now this war in Ukraine. But in the developed economies, many of them have attempted to bring again stimulus into the system. That's why many of them are accumulating a great deal of debt. But we do not seem to have the room to bring in any stimulus. We are already in a great deal of debt, and I don't know if there are that many people who are willing to borrow us more in order for us to create the kind of stimulus that may generate the kind of economic activity that will be beneficial to us. So it's like a catch-22 situation for us, isn't it?
Yes, it is. What happened to Liz Truss in Britain? Well, something. She tried to stimulate the economy, tried to cut taxes and so on and so forth, and she did that wrongly because there was a hole in the budget already, and then you're going to create a greater hole in that budget, and she never thought through, how she was going to fund it. And then so the bottom was almost going to go off the British economy, and that was the challenge they had there. But here, the central bank. Central bank is, to some extent, part of its mandate is to do development banking. So central bank goes into agriculture and so on, and then ask theater and spend some money and use subsidized credit and so on and so forth. It's part of their mandate. So we can also, the central bank can do that, outside keeping strictly to its instruments. So here we have that possibility. And of course, central bank here has been criticized that even by the international finance organizations that it's not keeping to its mandate. It's going outside its mandate in doing development economics, but we do that. And then, of course, we are talking about borrowing. We just create inflation. We just use liquidity. For instance, now recently we are talking about changing the currency notes, changing the colors and so on. Some people raise issues about how it's going to fund this and so on. So I said, well, the mint is doing it there. They're not going overseas. And so the mint to print the thing, and then just any expenditure, we're printing the money and the liquidity is being increased, and then you're having inflation all over the place. And then so we'll just have to bear it. And then I hope that in due course, we shall all our necks will be saved.
That will be that prayer you ended with will be what a lot of people will be saying amen to. But thank you, Dr. Chizia, for your time this morning. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Ladi. Thank you for having me. Yes.
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has called recent comments on Ukraine by Pope Francis unchristian and hard to understand. In an interview with the Jesuit magazine America, Pope Francis had spoken about what he called the cruelty of Russian forces in Ukraine. Mr. Lavrov said such statements were, however, incomprehensible.
Francisco. Of course, Pope Francis has called for negotiations, but he recently made a certain, very unclear statement, absolutely unchristian, putting two peoples from the Russian Federation into a category from which you can expect cruelty in combat operations. We have reacted to the Pope's remarks. Our ministry has, Czech Republic has. The Vatican said they hope it would not be repeated. They said a misunderstanding had occurred. Of course, it is not helpful. It does not help to promote the authority of the Holy See.
And staying with religious leaders, the Archbishop of Canterbury has praised the, quote, extraordinary courage of the Ukrainian people while on a visit to the capital, Kiev. The Most Reverend Justin Welby said the visit was about showing solidarity as Ukraine faces a humanitarian catastrophe. Across Ukraine, missile and drone strikes have left millions without electricity, water, or heating. Ukrainian and Western leaders have condemned the strikes as war crimes. But before going to Kiev, Mr. Welby met Ukrainian refugees in Warsaw, Poland, which he said was deeply moving. In a speech on the first day of his three-day visit, the Archbishop praised Ukrainians for their extraordinary courage in the face of Russia's illegal, unjust, and brutal invasion. And in a related development, Spain has stepped up security after revealing a number of letter bombs had been sent to high-profile targets, including Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez. An employee of the Ukrainian embassy in Madrid was lightly injured when a similar device was exploded. Officials say the defense minister was among the other targets. Another device was also sent to the U.S. embassy. It is thought the bombs could be linked to Spain's support for Ukraine, but no one has yet claimed to have sent them. Russia, which invaded Ukraine in February, has condemned any, quote, terrorist activity, saying such threats or acts were totally reprehensible. On Thursday afternoon, the U.S. Embassy in Madrid confirmed that it, too, had received a suspicious package, thanking the security forces for their help in dealing with it. The Spanish government had earlier said that explosive devices had been sent to 5 targets. It said an envelope containing pyrotechnic material had been sent to Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, but was intercepted before anyone got hurt. And the new Director General of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine has been denounced as a collaborator following his appointment to the position by Russia's occupying forces. In a statement, Ukrainian energy company Energoatom, which ran the plant before the war, accused Yuri Chechenyuk of collaboration and treasonous activities and said it had fired him from the company. The Russian agency running the plant since its capture by Russian forces in March claimed Mr. Chenichuk had been promoted from chief engineer to director general. The president of Energoatom, Petro Kotin, condemned Mr. Chenichuk, saying he had betrayed Ukraine and gone over to the enemy. Mr. Kotin says, quote, instead of making every effort to liberate the plant as soon as possible, he decided to help the Russian occupiers legalize their criminal seizure and now incites other employees to do the same. Switzerland has frozen over $7 billion in Russian financial assets, and that's according to the Swiss State Secretary of Economy. The SECO, as it's known, says the total amount of seized financial assets since the start of the Ukraine war now amounts to about $7.89 billion as of November the 25th. Additionally, 15 properties attributed to sanctioned Russians in Switzerland have also been seized. A total of $48.5 billion belonging to Russian nationals have been reported to SECO for investigation. All right, let's talk to Laddie Williams on this final day of the week. Yeah. TGIF, huh? TGIF. Is it really TGIF? The EU is edging closer to imposing $60 a barrel cap on Russian oil. The Russians have said, we won't accept this, we won't sell on that basis, and there are divisions even within the EU as we speak. So not completely good news.
No, not completely. They still have a long way to go, with this whole capping, Russian oil issue. But at the end of the day, there's some, indications that they might come to an agreement today. The tracking to see if that actually happens, but some also see it actually extending, into Monday, because we've seen Poland, actually talk about being able to, the cap is still lower, than what Russia is selling at this point, because on the weekly performance there, we saw Russian oil actually sell lower than $60 in the week, and now we're seeing that cap, around $60. So looking at where Brent is now, we know there's still been volatility in that market. We've seen Brent, hit around $86, per barrel this morning. So it's kind of far off, when you look at, that price.
It's quite far off.
It's quite far, but, Russia has already been selling cheap oil, at this time. So,
but that's voluntarily.
Voluntarily.
Not under any cap.
Exactly. So with the cap, they've already said, you know what, if you're gonna, impose a cap on our oil, we're not gonna sell to you. And, we're seeing them have to balance, getting, Russian oil, into the global market so that there's not, much shortage, because when there's shortage, price is definitely going to go up. So we're still expecting a lot of volatility in that market, but there are plans to come to an agreement by Monday. So have the deadline. It's supposed to be,
the 5th.
The 5th, and so we're hoping, they might come to some kind of agreement, before.
There'll be a lot of people who will be waiting to see what happens. But the Russian banks have narrowed their losses. I mean, everyone expected them to lose money.
Oh, yes.
I mean, with all the businesses closing and leaving and throwing employees out of work and all of that. But the losses have amounted to a much smaller amount than was expected.
They've narrowed, quite unexpected, because one would expect the losses to, keep widening, at this point, because the sanctions, hit the banking sector in Russia really hard. They've been taking off, the international SWIFT network, so they're not able to make those, settlements that they're used to making, and where they can actually make, profits. So it's really hitting that sector. It's biting them, really hard. We've seen the biggest bank there, Sberbank, actually, give some good results, in the third quarter. That's according to the Russian central bank. They did, perform well in the third quarter. So they are seeing the sector, gradually improving, the third quarter, into the fourth quarter. So at the end of the day, the sanctions are still biting hard. They're having to deal with, interest rate hikes. They're also, having to do with the capital controls, that the central bank there has imposed, trying to, make sure that the outflows, from Russia are not so significant, to distort the financial sector. So they're still not out of the woods yet, because the sanctions are still there. They're still biting. That's why we see, the Central Bank of Russia there looking for other means for settlements. They've talked about blockchain, see how they can use that for the international settlements. But the banking sector, within there is actually going through a lot of problems right now.
The IMF's, head is going to China. We already reported that. But she's also saying that it's critical to front-load aid to Ukraine because costs are going up there.
Oh, yes, costs are really going up. We did, talk about millions of Ukrainians actually, don't have power and water at this time. So, she's coming out and saying, what, we need to front-load, the aid, that we're giving to Ukraine at this time, because at the end of the day, the country is having to deal with, war. At this time, we're seeing critical infrastructure, being hammered by Russian forces. So at the end of the day, money is needed at this time. They're going into the winter, you can't be without power, going into the winter. That's
absolutely
that's a huge risk, for a massive population of the country. So you're asking for more support. Obviously, there's a lot of support has gone into Ukraine at this time, but obviously the war is still on.
So they need more.
They need more, going. And obviously that that money is coming from somewhere, and at the end of the day, that money has to find its way back, has to be repaid somehow. So it's support that's needed, but at the same time it's costing the global economy a lot. And most of these countries that are also trying to lend this support to the country, but they need more support.
Indeed. I'm sure those who have been supporting will have said they will not get tired, so let's hope that they
don't
keep this
actually
up.
Get tired.
Thank you, Ladi. There'll be more on this last business day of the week. Ladi will have the details of that on Business Morning right after this, and then later on Business Incorporated. But for now, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's cross over from here to the British capital, London, where we're being joined by security expert Temitope Olodo, who is joining us virtually. Good morning to you. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, good morning, and thanks for having me.
Are you surprised that the EU, NATO, the United States, they're going ahead to sell weapons to Finland and Norway as part of shoring up what they described as the flanks of what will eventually be NATO members? Are you surprised?
I'm not surprised. 282 days into the Russia invasion, as we call it, $380 million worth of weapons is being sold to Finland, which is actually the north flag of Europe. Unfortunately, it looks as if Russia has miscalculated. Just like what President Biden said yesterday, Russia seems to have miscalculated because, prior to this crisis or this invasion, Finland and Sweden and the others would not have even thought of joining, NATO. They will have remained neutral. But what we're seeing now is that NATO is gaining more strength, as a result of this unfortunate incident that is happening in Ukraine. And of course, we know the war is still raging, but the American president made it clear that they will be more than happy, to sit down with Russia when they are ready to negotiate. I know France has a different opinion on that. But the bottom line is that nothing is surprising me now with regard to this conflict. And we could see that of course, the winter is coming in, and I know my colleague yesterday talked about, the impact of winter on, slowing down the fight and everything else. But the bottom line still remains that this is ranging on, and there is no stop to this crisis, from my perspective and from what we can see.
Now, I'm happy you mentioned the stalemate, because that was going to be my next stop as a result of the weather. I mean, as you pointed out, the guest I spoke to yesterday talked extensively about the impact that the winter would have, and everybody expected that things would naturally slow down in the winter because the winter is particularly harsh in the region of this conflict in particular.
Yeah.
But what one was expecting was that with the slowdown, that would give do-gooders, pardon my use of that word, an opportunity to step in and try to put in some kind of negotiation quickly. The Pope has put forward his offices, although that has become controversial. The Turks have also tried to step in at a point to say, look, can we just get together in a room and let's talk. Let's talk. But all of this have stalled. So there's a stall on the battlefield, there's a stall in the negotiations. The only thing that seems to be moving is the grains ships that are going out of Ukraine. Again, are you surprised? Why is this the situation?
It's just so, it's a paradox, and I'm a bit surprised. My hope was that the Pope intervened. It would have been kind of a non-partisan individual getting involved, or state-like person getting involved. But of course, it's misspoke in the process, and that the Russians are not quite happy with. At least there's one thing that is going. We know that at least 1,300 plus, exchange of prisoners as we're moving close to Christmas. The Ukrainian leadership called them heroes. 1,319. So let's see if maybe that exchange and the fact that even the Ukrainians are saying that the amnesty that they've given to the amnesty, kind of radio transmission, for people calling in hotline, calling in to say, okay, we're Russians, we don't want to fight this war. Maybe that will also help. But there's a lot of propaganda on both sides. What we really need is the leadership approach being adopted by U.S. president on this matter, because we can war, but we need to be able to find a way where we can talk. And I think this talk, opening up a window for conversation is very important. I'm concerned that, of course, France, being in Europe, is saying that they're waiting for the signal from Ukraine. And we know that Ukraine has said that they will not even negotiate they will not negotiate, they will not have that conversation. I'm hoping that the American president will intervene and there could be that at least matured conversation to try and bring this, resolve this issue. And maybe with this prisoner swipe and things like that, things can settle down a little bit.
You are an expert in this field, and I want you to establish how the decisions are made, because a number of those who are supplying Ukraine with weapons are trying to make a distinction between weapons for defense and offensive weapons. So they don't, there are some very important weaponry that if Ukraine had, it could, as it said, defend itself more effectively. But those who produce, manufacture, and own those weapons are very, very wary of transferring those weapons to Ukraine. They are prepared to do some, but not all, not much beyond a particular level. How do you strike this kind of balance? They want to support Ukraine to defend itself, but they don't want it to become as strong as they are, for want of a better phrase.
I think one thing that is important is that both parties, both from the Russian part and from the West, have always argued that this is just a conflict and it doesn't need to go nuclear. Because they know that even as much as we know that all they are doing, and I've mentioned this times without number, is that Ukraine is the playground. The bully is fighting. The people supporting the weaker individual is using the playground as a staging ground. And everything they are doing is just testing the might of Russia. And we could see that the might of Russia is no longer invisible. There's like fighting Tyson and somebody knocking out Tyson. Now everybody feels like we can take a shot at it. But whichever way you look at it, nuclear is still the determinant, and nobody wants to go down that. So, and to avoid going down that road, because we don't know how the wounded animal will react, everybody prefers to talk from a defensive perspective. Because we even know, as I know you reported, even the conversation with regard to Germany and Poland on the issue of the weapons that they could have exchanged with Ukraine, even the NATO is saying that there's a kind of a discussion going on. So they are all very, very careful about it. And I think, like I said, and I mentioned earlier, we need to find a political solution to this whole crisis. Because what we don't want is for Russia to feel too over-humiliated that they will look for an opportunity to use nuclear. And that is what the world do not need at this time. We are all feeling the pinch of this crisis, even though we know that Nigerian politicians, for example, are just doing their own. And I've not heard anybody talk about how Ukraine is impacting on food or whatever. But we'll see how it goes. But I think I'm a bit. My fear is that we do not go nuclear at any point. That is where the red line needs to be, and that is why I'm happy that they are also using that language that everything they're doing is defensive rather than offensive. Because of course, the Ukraine is taking the war to the Russians, but with weapons which are still at that low state that would not hit Moscow or anywhere else. Because if it goes down that route far into Russia territory, then we are in trouble.
Happy you referenced the impact of the war in Ukraine on other places. You are in the British capital, London. Britain has had 4 prime ministers in quick succession over a very short period. I think over about 6 years, 7 years or so. Yeah. That has been partly due to the economic situation. Now we've got Rishi Sunak. He's gone to Ukraine to offer his support and so on, but it doesn't seem, and maybe I'm wrong, and that's why I'm asking you, it doesn't seem as if this support is going to be as high profile as it was under Boris Johnson, perhaps because Britain itself is facing an economic crisis and it cannot be seen to be supporting citizens of another country while its own citizens are facing difficulty. Is that a good reading of the situation?
I think you've hit it on the nail as a serious political analyst. You will remember, just like President Buhari, when he came in and he said, I'm going to look internal, I'm going to go to Niger, I'm going to go to Chad, the countries closer to me. That is what Sunak had done. Sunak has said, I'm actually going to look inward and deal with the UK problem, issues. It was not until it was called out that climate change and climate issues are also part of issues affecting Britain that he decided, reluctantly to go to, to that summit, to that World Summit, because he was not planning to go anywhere. He wanted to stay in-house. Because whether we like it or not, Conservative is likely to lose the next election. We've seen it. The writing is all over the world. Even the by-election that was held just yesterday, the Labour Party had a 10,000 or 11,000 majority over, over Conservative that were holding that position not because of the scandal that happened and made the member of parliament that was in that position to exit. So you could see that in his party, there's a lot of crisis going on in the country. There's a lot of coordinated strike from different labor unions are coming. They intend to make the winter a winter of content. There's a lot of issues going on. Most of us are wearing 10 clothes, if not 15, at this moment, because once you put on the heater, it flies as if something is happening. So it's happening. So he needs to concentrate on issues at home, even though he needs to continue to show support because, of course, we know that a lot of British people really support, the Ukraine.
The Ukrainians.
There's a lot of controversy with regard to, the asylum issues also, because it's as if it's one group against one group. You are supporting one that is European and you're not supporting the other one that is not European. So let's not even go into that. But there's a lot of issues going on. So his party needs to try and muzzle themselves over and get things working for the next 2 years. Otherwise, they will be out and they will lose massively. Of course, there's no doubt that they will lose, but at what margin?
By what margin? Exactly. That would probably be the question everyone is asking. Thank you very much, Mr. Temitope Olodo, security expert, joining us from the British capital this morning. Do stay safe and stay warm. I hear the winter is brutal. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a lovely week. Thank you.
You too. In spite of the war in Ukraine, Nigeria-Russia relations are continuing apace. About 107 Nigerian scholarship students have arrived in Moscow for the 2022-23 academic session. The scholars arrived in 3 batches. The current batch of 32 came along with an officer from the Federal Scholarship Board and arrived in Moscow, where they were received at the international airport by Professor Abdullah Yibakwal Shehu, the Nigerian ambassador extraordinary and plenipotentiary to the Russian Federation with concurrent accreditation to Belarus. A majority of the students are studying medicine, engineering, and technology. And overall, Nigeria has more than 500 students in the Russian Federation under the bilateral education scholarship, while more than 1,500 students are private, spread across Russian universities.
Nigeria and Russia, we have maintained a very long and warm relations since independence in 1960. And one of the main thrusts of our relations with Russia is the bilateral education exchange program. This program started long ago, since during the Soviet Union. And after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the establishment of the Russian Federation, this program has continued in earnest, and Russia is one of the countries that has been consistent in providing this bilateral education award to our scholars. It is a great opportunity for you to be here to study under this scholarship scheme.
And on to the sports. Sprint canoeist Yuri Cheban, Ukraine's most decorated male Olympian, is ushering his 2 gold medals and 1 bronze to support the country's war efforts amidst the invasion by Russia. Cheban, a 36-year-old who coached Ukraine canoeists at the Tokyo Games, took 500 meters bronze in 2008 before his 200-meter golds in 2012 and 2016, all in individual races. He and boxer Vasily Lomachenko are the only men to win 2 Olympic gold medals for Ukraine, which began competing independently in 1994. And Russian and Belarusian teams, players, coaches, and officials have been banned from all World Baseball Softball Confederation Europe events in 2023. They were already barred from all events this year because of the war in Ukraine and the WBCSC in Europe. They have largely been frozen out of international sports since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And finally, on the program, volunteers have taken part in a rapathon to ensure children in war-torn Ukraine get Christmas gifts. Dozens of people chipped in to wrap gifts at Clayton High School near Ipswich, with more than 4,000 toys wrapped in the first few hours alone. It was hoped 20,000 presents would be transported by lorries to Ukraine, leaving Ipswich on the 12th of December. Organizer Jeremy Fish said they wanted to bring, quote, a little joy to children's lives in time for Christmas. Preparations for Christmas already on the way. Thanks for being with us. That's our program this Friday. My name is Ladi Akiri Dunduale. We're back on Monday with a fresh edition of the program. But for now, do go out there and have yourselves a lovely weekend ahead. Good morning.